Hello again. Welcome back. We've got a couple of theorists to talk about today, and they are Anthony Giddens and Pierre Bourdieu. And each one is talking about very relevant modern, or I should say late modern or postmodern things. So we'll have a lot of fun, I hope, going through some of this. I'll have fun going through it with you, and I hope you have fun following along. Giddens is British, and he's still alive, born in 1938. He got his undergraduate degree from Hull, and then his Master of Arts from the London School of Economics, which I've mentioned in previous slides is a very good school. And then he went on to lecture at various universities, received his PhD from Cambridge, and then was able to come back, which is fairly unusual, to become the director of a school he once was in, director of the London School of Economics, a very prolific writer, author of 34 books, and like Ralph Dahrendorf, his career has varied from not only sociology but also into politics. He was an advisor for Prime Minister Tony Blair. If we're talking about sociology, there's a fundamental question that's often at the heart of many debates. And the question is what's the relationship between a structure that someone is in, and an agent, or someone who can act? A lot of the time people tend to create this dualistic idea about structure versus agent, or structure versus agency. And he argues that this is a really silly thing to do. It's a false dichotomy. You cannot have one without the other. Here is an example how I might explain this that can clarify. I study homelessness. So one of the things that you'll often hear people say is homelessness is the result of individual character flaws of homeless people. So those people say homelessness is the result of somebody being crazy, lazy, or stupid. And that's rooted in the individual. So they put the blame on the agent, okay, the actor. There are other people who say, well, perhaps homelessness is the result of structural problems like unemployment, like difficulty establishing a place to rent or own because it's expensive, a lack of mental health services for people, a lack of welfare programs for people who face poverty. So those people tend to focus more on the structure. And again, Giddens is making a case that if you err on one side or the other, or focus on one or the other, you're really, it's a false dilemma. So this is a very unique aspect of his theory. What he says is that the social structures that we live in every day are what's called, some $10 words here, recursively and reflexively produced. So what does that mean? Let's unpack it. Recursive is repeating itself. So it repeats itself, social structure and agency. They make themselves over and over again. And they're also reflexive. Reflexive means referring back to the same thing. If I'm reflexive in my teaching practices, for example, I reflect on them and I evaluate them and think about them in order to do them again. So that's all that means, that they produce themselves over and over again, and they involve our own self-reflection on structure and agency, and that's how the system we have, social systems, continue. So, as I just mentioned, Giddens doesn't think that this structure, agency, or agent divide really exists or is fruitful. You can't have structures without agents, and vice versa. And so what he develops then is his own unique name for his theory, structuration theory. So how does this agent structure system reproduce? What are the characteristics of it? he says that social structures exist through the way that people use rules and resources. So again, the structures are products of agents, and the agents are always within a structure. And so in my own life, I have to think about, well, what are the rules that I would need to follow in order to be a good professor, someone who's a good teacher. And I have some say-so in how I conduct myself within that. So there's this structure, but also I am able to make choices. I have some autonomy within the structure. I'm an agent. And I also have different kinds of resources. So in some instances, I may use a webcam, which will allow me to talk with you, and you can see someone who's actively engaged and interested in the material. I also have these slides where I can present information to you in a particular way that I think might help you remember it, connect with you. I might also use the actual materials that I'm basing the course on and that Kenneth Allen has based his book on. So that's how social structures exist, through individuals' use of rules and the resources around them. And you can think about this in terms of your own life, how you create your life by following rules to some extent and using rules, and the resources that you bring to the different parts of your life. He talks about different aspects of everyday life, like normative rules. These are rules that govern behavior. Signification codes, and these are the rules through which meaning is produced. So, for example, speaking and writing. We have ways of speaking and writing, and that they might follow certain things, like, for example, a pattern which relates to conveying an argument. Another signification code would be the way that a paper in your composition class is supposed to be structured, with a thesis, with paragraphs that relate back to the thesis, with support, etc. So, rules through the way meaning is produced. Authoritative resources. These are the techniques, technologies of management, organizational position, expert knowledge that individuals might have. Allocative resources. These are forms of control over material goods or the material world. So all four of these things relate back to the way that individuals work within and reproduce structures, and how those structures work to reproduce agents. This creates what Giddens calls modalities of structuration. So people, again, they use rules and resources in the way of creating this structure through interaction. So you know how to act in situations, and you have three things that Giddens points out: practices, modalities, and structures, all working in concert and inseparable. So let's unpack that, because it's a little abstract. I'm going to read you a small section from Giddens, from Kenneth Allen's description of Giddens' idea. Modalities of structuration isn't as complicated as it might seem. Let's use the example of you talking to your professor in class. Let's say in this conversation, you refuse to take the test that he or she has scheduled. The professor reacts by telling you that you'll fail the course if you don't take the test. So what just happened? You can break it down through Giddens' Modalities of Structuration, following the model that's in the textbook. First, there were actual social practices that involve communication and sanctions. Your communication was interpreted using a scheme that both you and your professor know. For convenience sake, let's call this scheme, quote, meanings in educational settings, unquote. You know this interpretive scheme because it's part of the general signification structure of this society at the beginning of this century. Second, the professor invokes sanctions based on the norms of classroom behavior. Again, you both know these norms because they're part of the legitimation structure of the society. He says, I'm sure you were able to follow the discussion through the model without any difficulty. So all those 4 component parts appear in the example. And the modalities of structuration, then, you saw the practices, the modalities, and the structures, again, working in concert. Giddens argues that we have created something called time-space distanciation. And what does that mean? Basically, that these days we take for granted the idea that we can, or already do, stretch out our co-presence, our proximity to people over time and space. And he's doing a nifty move in terms of theory, because he's discussing things in a slightly different way than theorists that preceded him. Time and space are variables for Giddens, and important to think about, because what happens is that we make abstractions of things like time and space through things like, for example, the timetable of a bus. So you can look at the timetable, you know when the bus is coming, and you know when you will be at a certain destination. So we've created a more abstract relationship between time and space in the modern and now in this late modern era. Before, people were very place-bound, and time and space were very intimately connected. But these days, you can say to yourself, well, okay, I'd like to get a package from Amazon. Okay, I'd like to get it in 5 days. All right, well, now that I think about it, maybe I'd like to get it in 3 days. So the 5-day charge will be less, probably, than the 3-day charge. So we've created a complete abstraction about the relationship between time and space as variables, and Giddens is taking this into account. It's very clever. So Giddens argues, like Mead, Garfinkel, Goffman, that we are creating society in face-to-face interactions. That said, though, there are a lot of things that we're less aware of in how we reproduce society and our social order every day. He says there are 3 things in interactions that we are either more or less aware of. And the first one is reflexive monitoring. What does that mean? It's that idea that Mead talked about, and also Charles Schwartz Cooley, who you might recall he talked about the looking glass self. We see other people's reactions to us, we interpret what we think are those reactions to us, and then we act. So reflexive monitoring is similar. It's we're watching behaviors of other people, monitoring the flow of our conversation, we keep track of our actions. Okay? With that, we also are looking at the reasons we're doing what we're doing. And that's the rationalization of action. And he talks about 2 different ideas in the textbook: discursive consciousness and practical consciousness. Let me explain discursive. Discursive is, if you open up a dictionary, it means wandering from topic to topic. But you can think of it as a verbal account or some type of explanation. Discursive consciousness, you can give a reasoned verbal account. So that links back to Garfinkel and his ideas of accounts. Practical consciousness is knowing that is the knowledge we have about how to exist and behave socially. And if you remember Garfinkel, people can't often verbally express this. They're aware of social rules, but they're not aware of them until they're broken, and then they understand them a little bit. So we, according to Giddens, we act a lot more by intuition than by rational thought. And that brings us to the motivation for action. he mentions the idea of routinization. And routinization means just making something routine. Okay? He argues that the importance of our motivation for action, a kind of an unconscious motivation we have, is this drive for routinization. We want things to be regular, repeated, ordered, so that we have some tethering to the world in a way that we'll be able to anticipate a little bit how things are going to go. If everything was a surprise and new to us, we couldn't make any sense of it at all. So, he says here, Alan, he says, it's like driving a car or riding a bicycle. Most of what is involved is done out of habit or practical consciousness. In the same way, most of what we do socially on a daily basis is routine. So these activities that we do routinely, like, for example, going to class or going to a restaurant, it's how our face-to-face interactions are stretched across time and space, so that we don't have to be around each other all the time to have a reasonable understanding of how things are going to go when we see each other. Like if you go to a restaurant, what the routine there is. If you go to class, what's the routine there? You go to work, you don't have to spend all of your time at work to understand how you are to act once you go back there, if you go away. So that's how our face-to-face relations are carried out over time and space. And that relates to this concept of regionalization. It says the zoning of time and space in relation to routinized social practices. And what that means is that social practices occur in specific places and times. So again, in the course of your day, you've done this quite well. You regionalized your behavior from a classroom to a family setting to a workplace to being with friends. You have divided up those spaces and will be able to interact with those people even over passage of time when you're not around them. So these regions vary by their form, their character, and the duration and span of time over which you can participate in them. Now, we get to something fun to think about. If you can, for just a second, I'd like you to think about, for example, trust and the extent to which you have to trust various people and institutions. Here's a case in point. If you were to drop off your clothes at the dry cleaner, you have to trust them. And you have to trust them to not only clean your clothes, but do it in a way that is not going to put chemicals that are unhealthy into your system and maybe cause you cancer. You trust me as an instructor to know what I'm talking about. The funny part, though, is that I'm the instructor, and so inherently you don't know if I know what I'm talking about. Do you see my point? I have to convey it to you. And we, for example, trust our water supply. And I remember maybe, I don't know, a few months ago, I got a warning letter from the utilities company here in Kearney saying that they had found some problems with the water and it was within an acceptable range of pollutants and that they were keeping an eye on it, okay? So all these things are about trust. And what Giddens says is that in our current era, one of the most consistent emotions that we have is we feel anxiety because we have to trust so many different people and institutions that we really can't ever really know the extent to which they are doing what they're supposed to be doing and doing it well. You can't go to your dry cleaner and say, well, you know, I would like to actually watch the dry cleaning process So please give me a call when my clothes are about to be cleaned. I want to see that you're doing it right. Because even if you watched it, you wouldn't even necessarily be able to tell. So all of this relates back to a phrase, ontological security. Ontology means sort of what we know, okay? And security, of course, is this idea of stability. And so in this late modern era, the only constant is change. And with that, we have a great lack in this phrase, ontological security. We are constantly facing change and unknowns, and that creates anxiety. So what he's pointing out is that pre-modern societies had a lot more ontological security in terms of things like institutions like religion that provided a nice, clear foundation and routinization for life. There were single political systems. Families were not as diverse and maybe in some ways as the family is today, kind of unstable, in flux. Okay? So he argues that we suffer from a lack of ontological security in our contemporary times. Our stretching out of our co-presence across our space and time, though, links our local interactions with more distant ones. So, for example, I have family in Seattle and in Los Angeles. I can call them and connect with them, and we're covering different time zones. But I can also visit them and know that they're going to actually be present in Seattle or LA when I go. We are able to understand our global system now, and that this whole distance of place plays out across time, and use that in coordinating our actions and lives. So some other things Giddens talks about. Today we engage in radical reflexivity, which means that before the modern era, we didn't really think so much about society. We didn't reflect on it so much. Now, if you pick up any USA Today or New York Times, you see constant reflection about society. You know, is crime going up? What are our rates of cancer? What should we do about healthcare? We're constantly thinking and rethinking this idea of how should society be, important social issues, etc. And you'll remember that one of the key elements of the Enlightenment was progress, okay? And the idea that we can rationally make the world better. Progress demands reflexivity. So, for example, in my teaching, I regularly give a course evaluation at the end of the class. Students respond and they say, well, Borchardt did this well, Borchardt could have improved on this. And then I'm supposed to take that information and use it to develop and improve my course and my teaching. Okay? So we're in the era of constant reflexivity. And that is reflected in this idea of bureaucracies, like the educational bureaucracy at UNK, is involved in self-assessment. We have monitoring bodies which decide, well, okay, you're going to be accredited or not, depending on how well you teach. And then there's this other idea, too, that science always leaves room for doubt. So we have predicated our functioning in the world today based on, largely, science. That's the source of truth. And what Giddens is pointing out is that we do not have a lot of strong feelings of security based on science, because once you answer one question, you get three more, right, at least. So again, that feeling of anxiety is the dominant feeling, Giddens says, that we have in this late modern era. He also talks about time and space as being emptied, or emptying time and space. And what he's arguing here is that we've moved away from our natural rhythms, okay? That once people were very much connected to the rhythms of nature and land, and, for example, the processing of crops, the rising and setting of the sun. Those things made us in a concrete way attached to nature and our rhythms attached to nature. What he argues, though, is that like the invention of something like the mechanical clock, it meant that we could create an abstraction about time, and it allowed us to separate from those natural rhythms. So a mechanical clock says that we can divide up the day into 24 hours, and that we can do perhaps different parts of things that a society needs doing over the course of 24 hours. What could be another example of this? That if you want to get somewhere, you can figure out how much you need to spend to buy a ticket that will allow you to travel from one place to another in a particular amount of time. So our travel also has emptied time and space of its kind of concrete natural meanings. And we also, of course, can communicate cheaply and easily these days. You can use Skype for free. You can contact people across the world and see them face to face. So we have emptied time and space of its concrete connection to natural rhythms. Probably a great example of this is the long-distance relationship. You now can have an emotional bond with somebody who you don't share time zones with, or you don't share a geographic area with. So this is something that's, you could argue, somewhat unique to human beings. That relates again to that notion of disembedding mechanisms. We have created, again, forms of abstraction that lift our social relations and interactions from local contexts so that we can interact with people and negotiate things over very long distances instead of face-to-face co-presence type of interaction. So the key ideas behind this is today we use, Giddens points out, a lot of symbolic tokens as mediums of exchange. The great example would be money. Okay, money is a kind of a universal symbolic token that we can use to interact with people pretty much around the world. You want to buy things from people through, I don't know, again, maybe just Amazon. Somebody's selling a book in China. You use money, you facilitate that transaction, and you've had an interaction based on the symbolic token. We also have reliance on expert systems, like, for example, Dr. Phil. In the past, you, say, for example, have a problem with your house. Okay, your house, the windows aren't sealed correctly. In the past, you might ask your father or grandfather who built the house to help you fix the seal on the windows. Okay, so that was an immediate co-presence based interaction. If we've moved to this era with expert systems, then you don't need your grandfather or father. You need access, for example, maybe to YouTube, where you can go and look at experts from a show like This Old House, where they can show you what to do. And again, we are abstracting out. We have experts all around who can best tell us, in some ways, we believe, how to conduct our lives. So again, these are, and you think of that phrase, disembedding mechanisms, it means that we are in some ways very much free-floating in the world today, not linked to concrete time and space. That, of course, connects fantastically to the concept of globalization and our interconnectedness around the world. It involves capitalism, a shared system of production and exchange, industrialism. We now have production chains that involve what you would call the global assembly line. Value is added to products around the world. It might be conceptualized in the United States. Some of the raw materials come from other countries. They're assembled in other countries still and then shipped back. So this is a perfect example of some of these emptying of time and space relations that Giddens talks about. Globalization, though, also involves the monopoly of violence. States get to become the enactors of violence, and they have what's seen as the legitimate right to do that. And also, globalization involves increasing amounts of surveillance, and that's been very evident of late, where we learn that our emails are monitored. You might have your purchases monitored through cookies that are embedded in your web browsers. We have a lot of surveillance today. The reflexive project of the self is wonderful to think about. In the past, I mentioned before that the self was undifferentiated, that the self was really bound with the collective or the community that a person came from. So that means that the self really couldn't be seen very well apart from that community. Today, we have something different. The self is seen much more individually and as an individual project. The ideas of the Enlightenment of progress and rationality have come down to how we think of ourselves. We think of ourselves as individual projects. So we do things like focus on our appearance, and you have the mass marketing of beauty products, all kinds of various things to affect our looks, fashion. We focus on our demeanor and how we could improve that, right, through self-help, for example. The idea of sensuality and the ways that maybe you could go to, for example, the body shop and buy products that are more sensuous, that have different smells and textures. And we also engage in what are called bodily regimes. So, for example, exercising, dieting. Today, many people think of their body as like a canvas. So we work on our body through, again, dieting, working out. People might add tattoos or piercings to themselves to create their own creative display of self. And we also have today plastic sexuality. Giddens says that our expression of sexuality has moved away from reproduction, which was the real reason behind sexuality in the past, to an idea of sexuality as free and creative expression. So the reflexive project of the self, we create ourselves, recreate ourselves, and spend a lot of time thinking about ourselves as an object, usually with some goal of improving, progress, growing, becoming. And if you consider all the ways that we do that today, they didn't have, for example, anorexia back in pre-modern societies. These days we have diseases and disorders that are directly related to some of these reflexive projects of the self. Pure relationships, this is fun to consider. In pre-modern times, if you had a friend, that person helped you defend your honor, for example, or was interconnected with your sense of honor. They were probably someone you had a close tie with, tie to the group. As I said before, the self was not really differentiated from the community. It wasn't seen as so much separate, especially as it is today. And your friends were directly connected with survival, right? They helped you to live and stay alive. Today, though, friendship is based on different criteria. Authenticity. Are you for real? Are you being real with me? Are you truthful? Are you honest? Are you open to me? Do you open up? That's part of this process of mutual self-disclosure. Have you ever been in a situation with someone where you've asked them, how's it going? And they say, oh, fine. And you ask them, well, oh, what's new? They say, oh, nothing. they've put up a wall, and you aren't getting in. And that means basically that, according to our criteria for friendship today, you can't be friends because they're not interacting with you. People open up at different speeds, and if someone doesn't, then we don't see ourselves as being friends with them. What that means then is that we have a lot more stress put on what are the criteria for good or authentic friendships. And we also, though, it's kind of paradoxical, we have the ability to enter into them and also get rid of them freely. So people might say, well, this friend is really helping me grow, or I have such great conversations with this person, and I'd like to see more of them. And then if the conversations fall off in terms of interest, you might say, well, I have another friend who's meeting my needs in a different, maybe perhaps better way. So we can enter into these and dispose of them freely, but we're not as attached to them as we were in pre-modern times. The idea, though, is that criteria of the Enlightenment haunts us. We think in terms of progress, and we think in terms of growth and betterment. So these days, our relationships are constantly the focus of work and attention. We analyze them. If you look at the cover of Cosmo magazine again, if you're in the grocery store, it might say 7 ways to improve your sex life with your partner. It might say 5 ways to get better abs. You might look on other magazine covers and say 7 tricks to improve your memory. But we also focus a lot on how to improve our relationships. What are signs that you may have a toxic friend, for example? That might be the title of an article. Now we get into kind of a fun topic. Actually, a lot of these are fun, I think. But choice in life politics today. He argues, Giddens, that in the past, we focus a lot on emancipatory politics, or the politics of freeing people. If you want help, think of the Emancipation Proclamation. That's about the freeing of slaves. All right. So the previous model for politics was emancipatory, liberating individuals. So like with the civil rights movement. Today, what Giddens says is we've shifted toward life politics. We are more concerned not with helping collectives to become freer. We want to have our own life choices and pursue happiness. So we do personal lifestyle choice. And that means that, again, you are free to work on your relationships. You might say, I want to improve my body, or I want to join a group like Luminosity, a web-based group that is supposed to be about improving your mind. What's happening, though, is that we think of ourselves as something that can be endlessly constructed and worked on. The media shows us seemingly endless options for how to live our life. And we're saturated with media. They're constantly telling us better ways to live, how to be happier through this or that product. So what's happening for Giddens is that when we don't have this ontological security like we had in the past, the ultimate measure for our sense of worth and self and meaning is ourself. We can't get it from outside. Now it's more developed from within and our own project of the self. Pierre Bourdieu is French, so he's different from Giddens in that way, and he studied under the noted Marxist Louis Althusser, and he had an interesting career trajectory. In 1958 to 1960, he went to Algeria, which was a French colony that was at that point in the process of what's called decolonialization. It was no longer going to be a colony of France. He was a very prolific fellow, published 25 books in his lifetime, more than, and one of his most famous is Distinction, a Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste. I only have this one slide on Bourdieu besides the biographical material I just discussed with you. So everything is right here. Let me make the point of how Bourdieu differs from Giddens first. All right. Giddens said that the structure-agent divide didn't exist, that really that it was silly to talk about them as different, and that's how he came up with structuration theory. Okay, so Giddens said structure and agent divide doesn't exist. Bourdieu argues instead for what he calls a constructivist structuralism, which is quite a mouthful. But he says that structure and agency do exist, they are separate, but that they have equal weight and they stand in a dialectical relationship where one affects the other, which in turn affects the other. And if you want a reference or a refresher on dialectical ideas in sociology, the main fellow we talked about was Marx. The idea if you have a thesis and antithesis, the opposite of the idea, there's a tension between them and they fuse into a synthesis. Bourdieu, as a person influenced by Marx, and as I said before, studied under Louis Althusser, Bourdieu talks about capital, and capital creates more capital. So you can think of it as goods devoted to the production of other goods. So a capitalist might, for example, own a factory where they can create more capital, which then can create profits, which generate more capital. So it's this ongoing cycle of capital production. But Bourdieu is clever because he says capital isn't just manifest in physical material things. He talks about economic capital, and these are all, by the way, embodied by an individual. You've got economic capital, social capital, symbolic capital, and cultural capital. He says that economic capital of all these things has primacy, and that means that the class that you're in, the amount of money you make, will to some extent really influence how much social, symbolic, and cultural capital you can generate. And that each of these levels have their own effects. So what happens is that having money allows you to create more money. Social capital, having a certain kind of social stature or position, allows you to have and be able to get access to more social capital. You are able to learn more, for example, about a culture if you start to know something about that culture, right? Symbolic capital. This is the idea of, here I've got it right below here, that people have different amounts of symbolic power, like for example a professor. And symbolic capital has two parts. It has to be officially recognized in order to symbolically impart identity and have some relation to reality. So what does that mean? A professor is a socially recognized, legitimated position within an educational structure and hierarchy. And that has a certain kind of relation to reality. It also allows for the imparting of an identity for me and for other people. If, for example, I have a student who is looking for a job, I can serve as a reference for that student, and that carries a certain amount of symbolic capital, symbolic power, and weight. You might be looking for a job and you might say, well, I need a reference. I'll ask my mom. She knows me very well. But that position in that instance really doesn't have the same kind of symbolic capital at all. It's not an officially recognized way to impart identity, right? And it doesn't have reality in the situation of being a neutral, impartial person who can give an assessment of someone's abilities. Your mom knows you very well, but she can't serve that function for you. So you have, again, economic, money, social capital, being able to develop more social relationships with a few that you start with. Symbolic capital we just discussed, and cultural capital. If you know, for example, a lot about American culture, then you can find out more about American culture. So capital creates more capital, right, if used correctly. And that cultural capital is a very important notion for Bourdieu. It says here, it's about the informal social skills, habits, linguistic styles, and tastes that a person garners as the result of his or her economic resources. So the money that you have allows you to generate more social, symbolic, and cultural capital. And these things are captured in the phrase of cultural capital, this idea of skills, habits, linguistic styles, right? That rich people speak in a different way. They might have a different kind of dialect. They have different taste in clothing. They have different ideas about what to focus on. Polo, they learn about polo. They learn about wines and can differentiate between wines. So that's the notion of cultural capital. And it relates to this idea, habitus. Habitus is that your economic and cultural capital come to affect your very physical being in the world. So this is different from Marx. Marx talked about how the system of capital produces capital and it creates these classes, right? The capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat. This goes even beyond Thorstein Veblen's idea of conspicuous consumption, which is the idea of consuming in order to show off, to show that you have disposable money. You can buy goods and services and pay more than other people will for a similar product. Habitus means that your class really is inside of you in the way you organize your body. So things like how you walk, how you speak, how you use a fork and knife, your table manners, all of those are, for Bourdieu, the embodiment of class. And again, that goes beyond Marx's ideas about class and Veblen's notions of conspicuous consumption. Fields. This goes back to Bourdieu's fascination with rugby. He played rugby, and rugby, as Kenneth Allen points out, is a very grueling game, and it takes place on a literal field, but it involves individuals who have rules that they need to follow in order to achieve some type of goal, get the ball to the other team's goal. And the idea of a field is a space where a game is played. But it's not really about the agents themselves for Bourdieu. It's about the relationships between actors, the relationships among and between the positions set the parameters of a field. So different culture groups like theater groups, reading clubs, may have things in common, but they don't form a field because there's no explicit objective relationship. Right? The idea of fields can then be connected with linguistic markets. A market is a place for exchange, and a linguistic market then is a place you might seek profit. So when I go to a conference in sociology, I try to listen to and go to the sessions by prominent sociologists so that I can learn the symbols and the discourses and the way that they're speaking, the things they're talking about. If you've ever been in a situation where you are at a disadvantage in a linguistic market, you will know what I'm talking about. Here's the idea. If you were to, for example, go to a party where everyone is speaking about contemporary art in a very knowledgeable way, or seemingly knowledgeable way, and you can't follow the conversation, what are you going to do? You're probably going to shut up. You're probably not going to ask a lot of questions. So in that linguistic market, you really cannot profit, really, unless you keep your ears open quite a bit. You don't have the tools to create more capital to generate profit. And that relates to the notion of symbolic violence, that language for Bourdieu is a way for people to differentiate themselves from others and to symbolically put other people down. Oh, you obviously don't understand this or aren't in the know about these or that fact. So, for example, in sociology conferences, if somebody mispronounces the name of a theorist, other sociologists might laugh at that person. It's nasty, but that's the way that people enact symbolic violence on others to show them their place in the world. And I thought Bourdieu was particularly smart and insightful in pointing that idea out.